3 weeks before our wedding, I logged into our joint savings account to pay the final invoice for the venue in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was supposed to be another item crossed off a checklist we'd spent months building together. Instead, I froze. The balance on the screen didn't make sense. I refreshed the page once. Then again. Almost everything was gone. 6 years of careful saving, overtime shifts, skipped vacations, birthdays spent staying in instead of going out, reduced to a few $100s sitting in the account we had opened for our future. My phone vibrated before I could even process what I was seeing. It was Alyssa. For one impossible second, I hoped she'd tell me the bank had made a mistake. Instead, her message was only 2 sentences. "I'm so sorry. I've fallen in love with someone else. I can't go through with the wedding." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "We've never met in person, but I know he's the one." I stared at the screen, then back at the empty account. The missing money and the confession had arrived at exactly the same moment. That was when I realized I hadn't just lost a wedding. I'd lost the life I'd spent 6 years believing we were building. For 6 years, I believed Alyssa and I were building something solid. We met in our early 20s, grew into adulthood together, and talked about the future as if it were already waiting for us. I worked 12-hour shifts at a manufacturing plant outside Charlotte, picking up overtime whenever it was available. The work was loud, repetitive, and exhausting, but every extra hour meant another deposit into the account we'd opened for our wedding and, eventually, our first home. Alyssa handled almost everything else. She loved planning, and I trusted her completely. She chose the venue, compared caterers, mailed invitations, and spent evenings talking about flower arrangements, seating charts, and paint colors for the house we hoped to buy after the honeymoon. Whenever she asked my opinion, I'd smile and tell her I trusted her judgment. I meant it. Looking back, I can see the small changes I ignored because they seemed harmless at the time. She started spending more nights online, always saying she was relaxing after stressful days. The gaming headset became part of her evening routine. Sometimes she'd laugh quietly with people I never met, then quickly mute herself when I walked into the room. Weekends we once spent together slowly turned into weekends where she claimed she needed time to unwind. If I suggested dinner or a day trip, she'd tell me she was tired. Yet somehow she always had energy for another late-night gaming session. None of it felt important enough to question. When you trust someone completely, you don't search for hidden meanings. You assume the distance is temporary, the silence is stress, and tomorrow will bring everything back to normal. At first, I refused to believe anything was seriously wrong. Planning a wedding was stressful, and everyone kept telling us the final months before marriage tested even the strongest couples. I convinced myself Alyssa was overwhelmed. If she seemed distant, there had to be a reasonable explanation. I wanted one badly enough that I ignored the obvious. Then I started replaying the previous few months in my mind. Phone calls she once answered immediately now went to voicemail. Weekend plans disappeared because she was busy with wedding details, even though I rarely saw her working on them anymore. Every evening, the glow of her phone reflected across her face while she smiled at conversations that had nothing to do with me. Whenever I asked who she was talking to, she'd simply say, "Just friends from the game," before changing the subject. Those memories stopped feeling separate. They connected, like pieces of a machine finally locking together. Every excuse, every canceled date, every quiet laugh behind a headset suddenly formed one picture I could no longer ignore. The hardest realization wasn't that she'd met someone else. It was that she'd been building another relationship while I was still building our future. Every overtime shift I worked to afford our wedding gave her more evenings to disappear into a world I knew almost nothing about. While I measured progress in paychecks and savings, she measured it in late-night conversations with a man she'd never even stood beside in real life. By the time I understood that, the relationship I thought I was protecting had already ended months earlier. She simply hadn't told me yet. That realization changed something inside me almost overnight. The questions that had been spinning through my head suddenly stopped. I no longer wondered why she had chosen him, what he offered that I didn't, or whether there was still something I could say to change her mind. Every answer I wanted had already been delivered in that message. She hadn't accidentally fallen into another relationship. She had chosen it, knowing exactly what it would cost both of us. For 2 days I caught myself typing long messages I never intended to send. I'd explain how much we'd built together, remind her of our plans, Ask her to think about everything we were throwing away. Every time I reached the last sentence, I deleted the entire conversation without pressing send. Eventually, I understood why. I wasn't trying to change her decision. I was trying to avoid accepting it. Once I admitted that to myself, the sadness became quieter. It didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling every thought. The woman I intended to marry had already walked away emotionally long before she emptied our account. The missing money wasn't the beginning of the betrayal. It was simply the final confirmation that our future no longer belonged to both of us. From that moment forward, I made myself one promise. I would not spend another day trying to convince someone to stay where they no longer wanted to be. My responsibility wasn't saving the relationship anymore. It was protecting whatever remained of my own future before more of it disappeared alongside the life I'd already lost. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. Instead of confronting Alyssa, I started collecting facts. Emotions had already misled me enough. Numbers, dates, and records wouldn't. I downloaded every statement from our joint savings account and compared each withdrawal with my payroll deposits. The pattern was painfully clear. Almost every major contribution had come from the overtime hours I'd worked during the previous 18 months. The account that was supposed to pay for our wedding had slowly become something she viewed as hers to empty. I also reviewed old messages, bank notifications, and transaction timestamps. Piece by piece, the timeline became impossible to dispute. She hadn't acted impulsively after sending that final text. The transfers had begun days before she admitted the truth. She had already decided to leave while pretending we were still discussing guest lists and honeymoon plans. Then I noticed something that surprised even me. The morning after the account was nearly emptied, there was another attempted transfer. This one failed because there wasn't enough money left to move. The destination wasn't our joint account or any bill we'd shared. It was a newly opened checking account with only Alyssa's name attached to it. I stared at the screen for several minutes. That single failed transaction answered every question I still carried. She hadn't been protecting our future. She had been protecting her exit. At that moment, any lingering hope disappeared. The evidence wasn't emotional anymore. It was financial, documented, and impossible to explain away. Whatever conversation eventually happened, I already knew one thing with complete certainty. She had planned to leave long before she ever admitted it to me. By then, the story no longer belonged only to Alyssa and me. Too much money had disappeared. Too many people had invested time and trust into a wedding that now wasn't going to happen. After thinking about it for a day, I called her father, Walter. I expected him to defend her immediately or accuse me of exaggerating. Instead, he listened without interrupting until I finished explaining what had happened. There was a long silence before he finally spoke. "Can you send me the bank records?" The request caught me off guard. I emailed him every statement, every payroll deposit, and every transfer connected to our wedding account. Less than an hour later, Walter called again, sounding older than I remembered. "Alyssa told us something completely different," he admitted quietly. "She said the account mostly belonged to her, and that you became angry after she ended the engagement." I didn't argue. I simply told him the documents would answer every question better than I could. Over the next several days, both families became involved. Phone calls replaced celebration plans. Instead of discussing seating arrangements and hotel reservations, everyone was trying to understand how 6 years together had ended with an empty bank account and a canceled wedding. For me, the conversations were strangely calm. I wasn't trying to convince anyone that I'd been wronged anymore. The records spoke for themselves. What had started as a private betrayal between two people slowly became something much larger. It wasn't only about a broken engagement now. It had become a question of honesty, responsibility, and who had been telling the truth all along. A week later, Walter asked if I would meet the family halfway at a small Italian restaurant outside Asheville. I agreed because there wasn't much left to argue about. The facts already existed. All that remained was whether anyone was willing to accept them. Alyssa arrived with her parents, but barely looked in my direction. She spent most of the time staring at the table, turning her water glass slowly between both hands. Her mother broke the silence first. She insisted Alyssa had been overwhelmed by the pressure of planning the wedding, that loneliness had pushed her towards someone who simply listened better. Every explanation sounded carefully prepared. I never interrupted. When she finished speaking, I reached into the folder I'd brought and placed several printed bank statements on the table. I'd rather let these speak for me, I said quietly. Walter picked them up first. He compared my payroll deposits with the withdrawals from our joint account, reading each page without saying a word. Then he passed them to his wife. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. The room that had been filled with explanations suddenly became completely silent. Finally, Walter looked at Alyssa. Is any of this incorrect? She didn't answer. She didn't deny the transfers. She didn't dispute the numbers. She simply lowered her eyes and remained silent. That silence carried more weight than anything either of us could have said. In that moment, the conversation stopped being about opinions or emotions. It became impossible to ignore what the records had already proven, and nobody at the table had anything left to defend. After that meeting, events unfolded without much involvement from me. I didn't make demands, threaten legal action, or ask anyone to take my side. The documents had already done everything I needed them to do. 2 days later, Walter called and asked if we could meet one last time. He handed me a cashier's check covering most of the money that had disappeared from our wedding account. He apologized for his daughter's decisions and promised he would personally repay the remaining balance over the following months. I accepted it because the money belonged to neither guilt nor pride. It belonged to the future I'd spent years working to build. Then another unexpected twist arrived. According to Walter, the man Alyssa had left me for suddenly stopped answering her messages. Once he learned she had emptied our wedding savings and walked away from a 6-year relationship to be with him, he disappeared almost as quickly as he'd entered her life. The future she'd imagined collapsed before it had even begun. Less than a week later, my phone rang. It was Alyssa. Her voice sounded nothing like the confident woman who had ended our engagement by text message. She said she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd been manipulated, and that she finally understood everything she'd thrown away. She asked if we could meet and talk, promising she would do whatever it took to earn another chance. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I realized I didn't feel angry anymore. I simply felt like I was listening to someone I no longer truly knew. I agreed to meet Alyssa a few days later, not because I was considering getting back together, but because I wanted to end the last unfinished conversation between us. We met at a quiet coffee shop outside Charlotte, where we'd spent countless Saturday mornings during better years. She looked exhausted, as though the previous weeks had aged her far beyond her years. The confidence that once filled every room had been replaced by hesitation. She apologized more than once. She admitted she had confused fantasy with reality and believed the attention she'd received online was somehow stronger than the life we'd spent 6 years building together. She told me the man she'd chosen had vanished the moment real responsibility entered the picture. Then she looked across the table and asked whether we could start over. I listened carefully because she deserved to be heard, just as I deserved the chance to answer honestly. When she finished, I realized nothing inside me had changed. I still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with, but she no longer existed in the form sitting across from me. Too many choices had been made deliberately. Too many lies had been told while we were planning a future together. Trust wasn't something either of us could rebuild simply because the alternative had fallen apart. I wished her well, stood up, and quietly walked toward the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was finally walking toward a future that belonged entirely to me again. Months passed before I could look back, without replaying every decision in my head. Losing the wedding had felt like the greatest disaster of my life, but time gave me a different perspective. The money eventually found its way back through Walter's honesty and determination to make things right. My career continued. My family remained beside me. Life, despite everything, kept moving forward. What never returned was the 6 years I had invested in someone who quietly chose a stranger over the future we'd built together. That loss couldn't be refunded or replaced. Yet, even that came with an unexpected gift. I escaped before vows turned broken trust into a marriage, before children or a mortgage tied me to someone who had already walked away emotionally. Sometimes people ask whether I regret what happened. I don't. I regret believing the wrong person for too long. Because the worst thing wasn't losing my wedding. The worst thing would have been standing at the altar without ever knowing who I was really marrying.
That's the end of the story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos for you, so pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.